All right. Well, we all learned something already. And I think that's a good segue into our conversation here on LinkedIn's Developer Productivity and Happiness Framework. Um, Welcome, Max and Grant. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Laura. I'm CTO at DX. Max is at LinkedIn, and Grant just started a new role at OpenAI. And welcome to both of you and thank you for joining. So Max and Grant together worked on publishing the LinkedIn Developer Productivity and Happiness Framework, which is what we're going to spend the next 45 minutes talking about. Before we get into conversation, one thing that the three of us would love to know from those of you who are here today is, what are you curious about understanding about the developer productivity and happiness framework, how LinkedIn measures developer productivity and happiness, anything around metrics? What do you hope that we talk about in the next 45 minutes, aside from growing cucamelons, which I'm now very tempted to talk about. But if you drop in chat a question for us or something that you're just very curious about, we'd love to hear about it. This is going to be a very informal conversation. We kind of want it to feel like you're just grabbing a coffee with Max and Grant, and we'd love to hear from you what you're interested in to make sure that we're getting the most out of your time from wherever in the world you're joining us from. Ooh, Emil, this is a good question. Um, why don't we actually start off with this one? Because I actually personally had a conversation about this just today as well. But I think now that we have DPH out there in the world and other lots of other resources and frameworks for measuring developer productivity, it's now sort of like at the top of a lot of executives' lists. What do conversations with executives about productivity sound like? So like, I would love to hear about your experiences, Max and Grant, like when you have this framework and like, what does it sound like when you actually operationalize and start to get insights using this framework? What do those conversations with executives actually sound like?
Yeah. So this depends on how much background the executive has in the subject of developer productivity. For an executive with a lot of background in developer productivity, you're like, so we want to like decrease cycle times and like we want to like reduce cognitive load. And they're like, yeah, of course, that's what you want to do. Yeah. And then for people with less experience, and also sometimes you're talking to even non-engineering executives. When you're talking about these subjects, you're negotiating with product, you're talking to a C-suite person or something like that, who cares about, like maybe you're talking to finance and they're like, hey, we spend a lot of money on software engineers and what do I get for that? A lot of the time those conversations start with, hey, first of all, what do you want? Like, what's the outcome that you're looking for? What's the problem that you're trying to solve? Understanding their viewpoint, and then trying to explain how the things that we need to measure or understand eventually result in the outcomes that they want, but that sometimes directly measuring the outcome that they want doesn't actually get the result that they want. So there's this back and forth of like, I want to satisfy your business need, but I want to do it in a way that's effective. And so I have to explain to you and convince you that I have the expertise, and I have to do that in a way that resonates with you. Like I can't just show up and be like, well, I know everything and you don't know anything, and so you should listen to me. Like that's just not a conversation that's going to work. And they can't come to me like that either. Like that's not a conversation that's going to work for the developer productivity and happiness team. If they just come in, they're like, well, we need you to do something and work, and because I know something about my area and I don't know anything about developer productivity, but I know everything about my area. So I need you to behave the way that my area behaves. That's not going to work either. So it's a really sort of an educational process that has to occur.
Yeah, I agree with plus one to what Max said. I think we also see, in the category of like some executives get it. Some executives understand that developer productivity can be transformative to a company. And one of the things I actually really appreciated about a past executive, he described developer productivity as though we were like pulling on like constants of the universe. So he was he was like, if we could do blank, we would be making like gravity, the gravitational constant, like less or more, you know? And so like it created this kind of feeling that like this makes up the fabric of our day to day. Like, and we kind of just take it for granted. We think like, oh, I run through CI and CI looks like this. But with developer productivity, some executives understood that like actually you could change the nature of your work, not just like the quality of it, not just the way it looks, but like the way it feels and the way it acts. And I think one more thing I would say is that a lot of executives are looking for, in my experience, kind of that like 10x change. They're like, hey, I don't want to just go like a little bit faster. I want to know, is there some way to go 10 times faster? Like, are we just missing something? And if there's something we're missing, how do I start investing in that? And how do I create kind of a bridge from where we are to where we should be?
Have either of you ever experienced it where looking at metrics have actually uncovered the thing that's missing, or like the unknown unknown that unlocks 10x productivity, or or whatever X we're looking for? I personally haven't, and I'm really curious if you ever have.
I think so. One place that I saw it that was actually really exciting was like we looked at build times. We looked at build times a lot. Like I spent a lot of time looking at builds. Um, and one of the interesting questions that came up was like, hey, there's a lot of like cold builds, like slow builds. So it turns out like slow builds are often cold builds, right? It's like, oh, it's not rocket science. But I think the aha moment came when someone asked, like, could we just eliminate that class of builds? Like, what would it take so that cold builds never happened? Could we build a system like that? Could we all live in a universe where like caches are always warm, things are already built, everything's somehow done ahead of time? And as we started to think more about that, we realized like actually we could build systems like that. Like we could download like precompiled binaries, or like we could give you an environment that's like already built whatever you're looking for. And if we kind of shifted how things work, like we did, a big investment in pre-computing these things, then cold builds wouldn't happen anymore. And so that was one transformation that I saw at LinkedIn that I thought was really powerful, where it was like, oh, this is actually going 10x faster. Because oftentimes the median like build time kind of measures your warm build, and the 90th percentile of build time kind of measures your cold build. And we would see places where like median and 90th were the same now. It's like, oh, we like eliminated a whole class of builds.
Yeah, I think I'm also trying to think about it, and I think that one is a kind of a good example, but it also sort of plays into the thing that I'm thinking about, which is that a lot of the time the 10x thing that you get is about a principle that you come up with. I mean, you might develop that principle and realize that it's a solution to a problem that you discover through metrics. Like, I think the thing that you're never going to get the 10x improvement from is like, hey, I looked at this metric and I figured out a way to incrementally improve the number to a slightly higher number. Like, that is really important. To be clear, like that activity is important once you believe that you are in a solution or in a state where you could reach a global maximum. Like once you have, like, through your principles of your development ecosystem and like your understanding of how to build solutions for developers are like, we believe in a theoretical sense that this solution could reach a global maximum of productivity from everything that we are aware, then yeah, start ratcheting up like all the metrics and the parameters of that system. But if you live in the wrong world, don't try to incrementally make the wrong world a better place.
Yeah.
This is some heavy stuff of like, yeah, theoretically, I think maybe the insights that we're looking for are right, eliminating classes of problems and not just incrementally improving problems that you know about, right? That's really where we're going to see the 10x gains. How I think one of the things that DPH touches on is like reconciling voice of the developer, lived experience, perceived experience of the developer plus quantitative data and putting them together. One of the things that you touch on very early in the framework is like all data should be collected in service of a decision. And if you're not going to make a decision from the data, then don't collect it, because it's maybe not a fool's errand. I think people are still curious about it, but it's not setting up the metrics in a healthy way to not tie it to decision. Can you think of an example or share some example from your personal experiences of like when you've seen that done really well, and like how that way of thinking about metrics has just a much bigger potential for impact on development teams than doing it the other way?
Yeah. Do you want me to talk about it both ways, like a raw, a bad, and a good example?
Yeah,
Or-
we can talk about like do this, don't do that.
Okay. So, once upon a time, there was a team that was measuring basically the success of their CI jobs. Just like that was the metric, and they decided to optimize how often, not just how often their CI jobs, but how often the whole like merge process succeeded, right? And when I would go to them, I'd be like, why? They'd be like, I don't know, just seems like a good number to make go up. Like there was no real like reasoning or like tying back to like what does this accomplish for developers. And I pointed out to them like CI jobs are supposed to fail sometimes. In fact, if they don't fail, they aren't very valuable. Like if they never fail, they shouldn't be running. And so like that's not actually like the world's greatest metric. I think one of the times that I've seen it be really effective is when you have an existing strategic initiative. So the best situation is you've done some early analysis, you've discovered some huge problem, like a smoking gun, like, oh my God, wow, I don't know, 20% of all of our build targets don't build at head, for example. Like imagine that like that was your situation, right? And
Just
then
as an example,
just as an example, which
throw that out there. Maybe something else.
just to throw that out there, just to imagine that fictional scenario. Um, and then you're like, okay, we're gonna have an initiative to make everything build at head. And so the metric will be, do things build at head? Like it's super straightforward. It's one of those like when it's especially when it's a quantitative metric and it's for it to be super actionable, it's always something like that. It's like we have discovered something really bad. We have an initiative to fix that really bad thing. We have a number that can go up very clearly that says that's going to be the really bad thing that we fix. And so that's as far as quantitative, that's how we go. Did you also want to talk about like a qualitative example, or?
I actually have one more example on kind of like the, I think, negative side, which is like a telltale sign to me that people were given a charge to build metrics without really like empowering a decision, is that like you come into an org, and this happened to us at one point. Like we joined an org and we said like, oh, we want to like, come alongside your metrics effort. They said, oh, it's fantastic. We said like, can you show us what you have? And they sent us a slide deck. And it was a slide deck of like 200 pages of screenshots. And we were like, what is this? Like, I don't know how to use this. And, they were like very confident and like very excited. And it reflected a lot of work. Like, we don't want to diminish that, like a lot of effort went into that. But as we dug into it, we were like, I don't see how you make decisions. And it was clear that like out of that 200, slide deck, probably less than 10% of those slides like really mattered for decision making. And like the other 90% had been just the crazy charge of like, go build metrics. So sometimes you get into these places where like, without trying to, like, we don't typically have to make 1,000 decisions every day, right? And if you want to generate 1,000 metrics, you totally can. And so people kind of run away with it. And you're like, I'm overwhelmed. Like I'm drowning in data now. Like I'm drowning in these screenshots. What do each of these mean? And yeah, I think to Max's point, like having one number that was like, okay, this is how many things, this is how many build targets successfully build. It's like that was really useful because it distilled it down to something that was like very digestible. And also, I think because it was so simple, when we like first looked at the number, it provoked a sense of panic. Like, well, that doesn't look like a good number. Is that real? You know, like it's always good when people first look at a number and they're like, that can't be true. And then you show them like everything you did, and they're like, really? Like, oh my God, how does this work? Like, how does anything work? You know, so there's often like a lot of skepticism. Like, how does anything work when you get to a really good metric?
I think I like the way that you phrased it, Grant, where you said like, I can't use this. One of the things mentioned in the framework is like knowing your audience. And when I work with engineering leaders, one thing that comes up often is like, it might be okay for your use case that you have a different set of metrics that you talk about with your teams versus ones that you're gonna show to the board, for example. Like I think a lot of engineering leaders are like, okay, we're gonna do metrics and like these are my metrics and I'm gonna use them for all of my, every single use case where I need metrics. And actually there's a lot more that goes into it when it comes to knowing your audience. So I guess like what kinds of metrics have you seen, or what's the difference, do you think, between metrics that are most useful for teams versus metrics that are useful for line managers, executives? What are some of the other like personas that you would call out where you might have a different set of metrics to use for them?
So there's so many different factors that go into this, but it mostly boils down to actionability. Like, do you have the power to move that number? Like, is the person does the person looking at the metric have the power to move that number? Once you're presenting something to the CEO, you can be very, very broad. Like, for example, there's a lot of bad things to say about measuring metrics like PRs per developer or something like that, right? But let's say if you have 1,000 or 2,000 engineers and you have an SVP or a CEO or CTO who's in charge of 2,000 engineers, and they want to know, how much is output increasing or decreasing, and you might be able to do that with some weighting for the size of them or something like that. Like that might actually be useful at that level. But at a lower level, it's a horrible metric. It's a terrible, terrible, horrible metric that you should not be optimizing for, because it's a large scale indicator of like the consequences of decisions. It should not be treated as something for an individual engineering team to look at, right? Like, if you go down to the level of individual engineering team, I remember there was a team that owned a web framework, and they had metrics that did synthetic tests of how long it takes to basically do an edit refresh in the web. It's in the web app where you make a change to the JavaScript code, it rebuilds, and then and you hit refresh and it redisplays on the page. And how long does that whole process take? And their metric was synthetic. It didn't measure what was actually happening. They had a benchmark that was basically running in the background. And for them, that was super useful because it allowed them to know on every PR that they committed to the framework, did they immediately regress something obvious, right? And they were like, we want to make this into a higher level metric. We want to expose this to directors and VPs and say, this is the success or the failure of this framework. And I said, no, instead at that level, we need to have more of an understanding of the overall experience that real people are having in the wild. And the individual team is like, well, the experience that real people are having in the wild depends on a lot of other factors. It depends on the build tool. It depends on their developer workstation. It depends on the network connection. It depends on their connection to Artifactory. And I said, yes, that's great. As a whole, the developer productivity and happiness group has control over all of those things. So for us as a whole, that's actually a fine metric for us to be able to measure at that level, because that's something we can take action on. And so and just to be clear, PRs per developer is not a great metric. If you have it, you should flank it with a bunch of other things, because it only represents a very coarse version of output. It is very dangerous to optimize for. It has all kinds of negative consequences to look at. But I was only pointing it out as the type of metric that if you are the CTO and you have 4 other metrics, like let's say you had that, and you had like the number of production incidents per change or something like that in addition to that, and you had And you also had some qualitative metrics around developer happiness and developer productivity overall for the company, and you could correlate all that data together. Then you can do something. Like if you're the CTO and you want to have like an overall like survey question that's like, how productive do I feel? And that's your like overall all up for engineering. That's great. You have total control over that. Like you're the CTO. I mean, at least at the CEO level, you have almost total control over employee productivity. And so like measuring overall employee productivity, great for you. For like an individual team, like a product team, if they're trying to be like, I want to optimize the overall productivity of my product team, the problem they're going to run into is they don't control a lot of it. So I almost always try to bias for who can take action. Can the viewer take action on that metric?
I also have kind of a sneaky test to answer that question. So I did this with a couple of directors. I never did it at the executive level, but someone will come and be like, hey, I need this metric to make this decision. And on the surface, it looks pretty reasonable. You're like, oh, maybe. And then you also look at it and you think like, that actually might be a lot of work to go measure. And so you say like, okay, I think we could get like a rough measure of that pretty soon. Could we have like a follow-up meeting and talk about it? And then you come to that meeting and, that rough measure might be pretty rough. Like it should be better than math.random, but like it could be pretty rough. You're like, here's the number. And then you kind of want to see like, if I gave you that number today, what would you go do? And it's not uncommon that people kind of shrug and they're like, I think I'm going to just continue in my plans. You're like, well, wait, I thought we had to go do like all this work to get this number to help you make a decision. And I just gave you a number that would like run contrary to your decision. And if they go, yeah, but there's actually a bunch of other reasons we're doing this, I just thought you could help. Then you're like, oh, okay. Well, then maybe we should just kind of like pause here. And when we actually need to answer a question that we're not sure about, we can re-engage. And so you kind of have to like, you have to be careful with that because you are sort of lying. Depends again on how rough that initial draft of the metric is. But it can be really helpful, at least as a thought experiment, to ask people like, hey, suppose I come to you and I give you that number. What would you go do? And if the answer is like, actually, there's not much I can go do, then you're like, well, then I don't know if we really need the number. Like, we're just, we have priorities and we trust you in your good judgment. So that was one of my like kind of tricks. You have to be very careful in how you use that trick, but it can kind of help you evaluate pragmatically what exactly is this metric going to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. That's a good little sneaky tip.
Yeah.
To I like that one. I like that.
I also want to plus one something Max said about incidents per change. I think that was like a really important detail there because I see a lot of people who measure like production incidents and they're like, oh my God, production incidents are going up. And it's like, yeah, but are the number of changes also going up? Like someone asked me once, which product has the most incidents? We should go spend a lot of time. I was like, well, whichever one has the most changes. Like, I don't think that's a hard question to answer. I'm going to figure it out really fast. And kind of creating a ratio, like I think what Max was describing is kind of like a ratio or something that balances that number to say like, well, we do have a lot of incidents here, but it's actually way better than some other systems that have been, neglected or have experienced like attrition. So a lot of like a lot of the like leadership in that area has left. And so there's a few number of incidents, but like per change, it's very risky. I really appreciated that, Max. That was a good call out.
Interesting. What didn't make it into this framework? Like, are there things, strategies, approaches that you've tried that just did not work or had like the negative or the opposite impact that you were hoping for? I'm sure there's some, and Max, I can tell you've probably got a few stories.
Man, I don't have this to hand in my mind, but there's so many things. I mean, first of all, there's a document that I wrote that during review, Grant made me basically rewrite entirely because like and that document was my original instructions to our team. And like if you think about the fact that like I basically had to rewrite the entirety of my original instructions to our team, like the things that we learned along the way. I think the biggest thing that I learned is that I mean, so there's a thing that I already knew, which is that you can't solve problems that people don't know exist. Okay, I already knew that. And yet somehow I thought this time would be different. Um, and so there's a lot of research, and you, Laura, and me, and Grant were all involved in the research community of developer productivity, have been heavily involved in it for a very long time. There's lots of papers around the right things to measure, how to measure them, all this stuff, right? A lot of which is academic, and some of which is industry based. And even the stuff that's industry based, the outcomes that have occurred from measuring those metrics are often unclear. Like if you look at the research papers, they're like, in our sample of people, we discovered that this metric is true, is usually what the paper indicates. The paper usually indicates like this metric is accurate, not that this metric produces change in a business. And I think the thing that we discovered is we were like, okay, we have this beautiful opportunity. We have a bunch of engineers, greenfield. We can actually implement a bunch of these like high level developer productivity metrics for the company. And just like in a vacuum, we'll just do them in a vacuum because we think they're a good idea. Research says they're a good idea. We're just going to implement them. And then we did it and we brought them to people and they were all like, so what?
And so what do you do to avoid that? Like if you build it, they will come. I've talked to many leaders who are like, I exposed all these metrics to my team, expecting that they're going to look at all these dashboards and be like, aha, I need to work on that, or aha, my build times are too low, or whatever, or too high. But actually nothing actually changes. The needle does not move. So like, what do you have to do in order to make these metrics actionable and to ensure that they're going to be used to create change?
So I think there's a few things. One of them is you have to have a convincing story for yourself that you believe that this is really important for people to move. And one of the best ways to do that is to start, like Grant said, not with a fully automated, pipelined, and dashboarded metric, but with like just do some queries and get some raw data and see what the numbers say. Show them to people, do your own analysis, do your own correlation analysis, do it just raw. You're gonna have to write a bunch of queries, join a bunch of data sources yourself, and just look at whatever you have and see. And ideally what you're looking for is a smoking gun. Like if you're going to do this as quantitative data or qualitative data, especially at first, if you have no data and you're starting off, like you want to, and you're looking at like either the qualitative data or the quantitative data, there will be something that is horrible. If your developers tell you qualitatively that things are bad, and there will be something bad, like or like like Laura, you've talked about like going and doing the rule of five, like just going around talking to 5 random people. If all 5 of those random people are like, man, things suck, my life is terrible, there is something wrong.
With the one caveat, that if your stock price is way down, that might be the real problem. So like we would sometimes see like in developer feedback that like, hey, everybody's happier with their developer tools. What did we change? And we're like, we didn't really change that much. Actually, we had to push a bunch of schedules out. What changed at the macro level? The stock price is up. It's like, oh, cool. That's interesting. So like sometimes that's one of the tricks I think of qualitative, is that like you are getting the input from a human, and humans have all kinds of things. So like you catch me on the wrong day and I'll be like, burn it all down. And then you catch me on the right day and I'm like, no, things are pretty good. It's sunny outside. Like I can see, like it's wonderful. And so I think filtering that, or like trying to kind of aggregate that, is challenging to say the least. But yeah, Max is totally right that like in general, if the qualitative says it's bad and the quantitative says it's good, you should trust the qualitative. Like humans are pretty thoughtful. Developers tend to be pretty self-aware. They know that things could be better and they're trying to tell you that.
Yeah. And I've found more smoking guns from the qualitative data than from the quantitative data. Although I have
Mhm.
found smoking guns in the quantitative data that the qualitative data didn't show. I think that's most common when people have just become so used to a bad situation that they don't complain about it anymore.
Like logging in, people are just like, no, it's cool. I log in like 20 times a day. Is that a problem? And you're like, yeah, that's a problem. Let me help you.
Well, they don't see that there's a different, like you're living in that world and you
Yeah.
just can't imagine that there's a different
Or
one to live in.
they think they're doing it in service to security. They're like, well, no, this is ultra secure. They're like, that's why I'm doing this. Like I'm paying a cost for a greater good. And you're like, well, maybe. I mean, I think we could push on security to like design a better system that authenticates you once and then it works a bunch of places. Or like we could have a big push for single sign-on across all these different apps. Or, like there's often something that can be done, but humans will get conditioned to the status quo. And then kind of they teach themselves narratives like, oh, I'm doing this for some greater purpose. Um, I have an example of like, I don't know how this would have made it or not made it into the framework, but like an example of something in our learnings, like we put a big emphasis on actionability. And so we started gathering feedback. We started trying to aggregate that feedback in meaningful ways. We gave it to leaders. Leaders were like, okay, this will start to influence my roadmap. And initially, I think we got feedback about the feedback from people that like, hey, I'm giving you this feedback and I don't always see changes happening. I want more actionability, right? And so we had this bias toward like, yeah, we should make this like super actionable. And we got all the way to the point where we were like opening a ticket for every piece of feedback given to us.
Did that for a while.
And then managers were like, actually, some managers, not all managers, but some managers who were getting a lot of feedback were getting really frustrated. They're like, stop opening all these tickets. Because, like, typically it would involve something like a legacy platform. And they were like, I'm not doing any investments there. The only thing I can do is close those as won't fix. And that just makes people pissed off. And like, I get that they're pissed off. I don't need you soliciting a bunch of feedback for it and then opening a bunch of tickets for me so that I talk to each one of them individually. Like the company has had to be in a hard position here. That's what we're doing. The action has already been decided. This is not increasing actionability. So you have to be thoughtful about like, I guess, thoughtful about how you process feedback and what you do with it. Opening tickets for every piece of feedback is not a great idea. And we learned that one, I think, the hard way. One other thing that came to mind was you have to like kind of maintain a posture that you're willing to be wrong. So I was really fired up once that like, hey, we migrated from like Python 2 to Python 3 a great many years ago. And there were some Python 2 specific like libraries that were still in the code base. And I got all fired up one day, like, hey, I'm going to go through the code base and rip these out. And I can use like more modern versions. And then I paused and I thought, like, well, I should actually measure, like, will that matter? Like, could that actually help build times or like what impact will that have? And I actually did a whole like cost benefit analysis, and the cost was like so high and the benefit so low that I was like, no, we should just leave them in. Like, it looks dumb, but we're not at a point where I can snap my fingers and change that. And so it's going to take too much work. Like, that's just not a good use of my time. So allowing yourself to kind of be like, oh, well, the numbers actually say this. I was really excited to do that, but I guess I won't do that. I should go look for more interesting things. Um, I think that's obvious. So like, I don't know how we'd put it in the framework, but it's hard to accept. Like you have to take on a posture of like, okay, I will actually believe numbers.
Yeah, I will believe people and I will believe numbers
Yeah.
and use that data. All data is something I say often because I think we like to be selective in which data we count as data, the kind that supports decisions that we want to make. But yeah, all data is data and we should use it. When or when not to be concerned about developers gaming the system? This is a question that came in actually on LinkedIn on one of the posts about this event was like, how can the DPH framework exist and OKRs, et cetera, without leading to Goodhart's law problems of people trying to, influence the metric and it becoming a poor measurement. I'm wondering, like, in all of your experience with actually implementing DPH, like, have you seen examples of it used nefariously? Because when I read it, I see this framework as something that is really in service to developers, that it is not in their best interest to fudge any of it, because truly, at its core, this exists to help improve their lives. And if they're honest about it, then they get, many happy returns. But what's your take on the risk of introducing metrics and then having development teams kind of game the system a bit to make it look better?
This is definitely an important consideration. The important consideration is the incentive that the person has.
Hmm.
So, like, ideally, like, if any metric is tied to a person's performance, then it needs to be a very, very good metric that is very hard to fake or game. And that's when you like most, but the only time that I would do that is for business metrics. I would never tie productivity metrics to a person's performance rating, any person's performance rating, any person's income, bonus, salary considerations, anything like that. Because it, for all the reasons described, and there's a metrics and performance reviews section. That's the only time that I've seen this become problematic. And so I have a bias of staying away from even defining or implementing metrics that could be used in that way. And if there are metrics that could be used in that way, I always try to require that dashboards don't allow them to be sliced down to numbers smaller than 100 or 500 engineers, so that you can only see the team. It is possible to have reliable metrics that people have that are tied to incentives, but you have to be aware that there could be an incentive to falsify the metric. There has to be a real consequence for falsifying the metric, for discovering that the metric has been falsified or gamed. And the metric has to be as close as possible to the measuring the real outcome that you want to produce in the world. So that, like, even if somebody games it, you produced the right outcome. Like, gaming it produced the right outcome.
Yeah, I think related to that, the cheapest way that we kind of did this was to use something like a median. So if you use something that's robust to outliers, it's very hard for one individual to like go and game your metric. You like, especially with medians, if you take a median over the whole population of developers and someone's like, oh, I can artificially make build times faster. I'm just going to run the build on my machine in a loop and like it'll be really fast and it'll just make me look really good. You're like, well, actually, like you're just one person. So over a population of 1,000, like if you can convince 500 of your coworkers to all do that as well and burn a CPU core in doing so, good on you. Like, let's see you try. And so I found that we often would design metrics where like these problems just weren't as big an issue. And you would totally see outliers. I can remember one great example of like someone had automated detection of a bad pattern in code review. And they just had a bot that ran around impersonating them and leaving like all these code review comments. And so if we did ever like an analysis that said like, well, who has the most code reviews or who has the most code review comments? This person was always by far at the top. And you would look at their changes and you'd be like, oh, like you actually have a robot. And I often, like, I went to that person once and I just said like, oh, I kicked you out of the analysis. Like I just excluded you wholesale. And they were like, well, that's not fair. Like I'm here, I did all that work. I said, yeah, but that's not how this works. Like it doesn't work as, a potential to game things. I get to use my human judgment too. And my human judgment says, kick that data point out. Or you switch to something like a median that's robust to outliers like you. And now do your best. Like it's fine. So I think there are some really cheap ways to kind of get there. That said, like analyzing medians is really painful. So I would always pick an average if I can. But yeah, you can design systems that are a little more robust.
Yeah, I think that's such an important kind of like industry example, lived experience from implementing this is like, I think the threat of Goodhart's law is actually a lot less than we might think because it is so easy to spot outliers, because truly it's like, okay, we can talk about like, okay, I'm going to stop squashing commits now. And like that might be something that's reasonable for you to change in a habit to stick to. But to really truly game a system, like you either have to set up something automated or like really deeply change a habit of how you work. And one of those things is pretty easily detectable because it's such an outlier. And then the other one is much harder to do, especially on the scale of a team of 100, 500 developers, where the metric isn't as easily gamed as we might think it is. But still something very important to think about when designing the metric and thinking about the incentive system around the metrics. We're just coming up to our last couple minutes, and I wanted to end with one question about measuring impact versus measuring work, and how we might separate the two. Because I think it's a hard thing right now, where I think in engineering, it's easy to measure output. Like it's easy to measure lines of code. It's easy to measure PRs and commits and all of these things. But how do we actually take it beyond just the output and start measuring like impact of work? Is that even achievable?
Yeah. So one thing is on those effort metrics, they are a cost. You should not look at them as a benefit. Like you should look at PRs per developer per day as like, or look at, if you have a total PRs metric, you should look at that as the cost of shipping your stuff to production. And you should look at it in the context of other things. I think my opinion has always been that the impact of a software engineering team is them achieving the goal of their team. That they have a metric that measures the success of their team and the work that they've done. And often that's a business metric. It's something that they've moved for the business. And that's their impact. And if I want an engineering manager to optimize for something for their impact, it's the impact they're supposed to have on the world, or if they're an internal team, the impact that they're supposed to have on the business,
Yeah,
not how
plus
productive
one to
by
that.
individual engineers. Yeah.
Yeah, plus one to that. Like the impact typically comes not through productivity metrics, it comes through business metrics. Um, I saw someone in the chat asked about like, oh, you think of PRs as like the cost. And there's I think kind of like story of someone saying like, oh yeah, we're going to measure lines of code. And they were like, that would be like measuring the weight of the airplane. It's like, if we make a super heavy airplane, eventually it can't even fly. Like that's not the right thing to optimize for. So I often think that like we should have that perspective that like, well, a lot of these things like builds are not an end to themselves. They're the cost of trying to get something done. And I want them to be fast so that the cost is small. And if I can, I want them to be few. So yeah, trying to decrease those costs rather than trying to maximize them ought to be our goal.
That is such a powerful paradigm shift for thinking about a lot of the output metrics that we have traditionally kind of been conditioned to see more as better, when we really should be thinking about less is better because it's a cost. A very nice thought to end on. For those of you in the audience, I put a link to the DPH framework on GitHub. It is open source. And Max and Grant, if someone has a question, anything, what should they do?
We have a GitHub discussion section. Just post there, and both Grant and I will see it.
That'd be great.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. We will send out the recording to all of you who have attended, and those of you who are, maybe you're watching this now because you couldn't attend and you're watching the recording. Time warp, wild. But thanks for watching this, if that's you. Great conversation today, Max and Grant. Again, thank you very much for joining. Check out the DPH framework on GitHub, ask a question in the discussion forum. Otherwise, we'll see you all around the internet. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Laura.
Bye. Thank you.